This is Law Bites, a podcast with Michael Geist.
The CRTC says it's time for the big players to share. Bell, Rogers, TELUS, and in Saskatchewan, SaskTel all have to sell wholesale access to their already established wireless networks, with the intent of creating more competition for Canadians who pay some of the highest cell phone prices in the world.
Rates have been going down, but they need to go down more.
But today's decision doesn't guarantee that is going to happen. Who can buy access is limited to regional carriers that already have spectrum and networks of their own.
Last week was a busy one in the wireless world in Canada. Just as people were debating the proposed Rogers-Shaw merger, the CRTC released its long-awaited decision involving the possibility of mandated MVNOs, or mobile virtual network operators. While the CRTC notably concluded that Canadian wireless pricing is high relative to other countries and attributed that to insufficient competition, it was ultimately unwilling to fully embrace a broad-based mandated MVNO model. To help break down the decision and these other recent developments, I'm joined this week on the podcast by Dwayne Winseck and Ben Klass. Dwayne is a professor at the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University and the director of the Canadian Media Concentration Research Project. Ben is a PhD candidate at Carleton, senior research associate at the Canadian Media Concentration Research Project, and a board member at the Internet Society Canada chapter. They both joined the podcast in a personal capacity, representing only their own views. Dwayne and Ben, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here, Michael. Thank you for having us.
Likewise.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you both in what is an exceptionally busy time in Canadian wireless. As you know, we booked this podcast initially to talk about the Rogers-Shaw merger, but as we recorded it, the CRTC less than 24 hours ago released its much anticipated wireless decision involving MVNOs. I'm hoping that we can explore both the CRTC decision as well as the merger, but I thought we should try to first set the stage with some discussion about what the data tells us about the Canadian wireless market, and I know the CRTC had some things to say about that as well. Both of you have been amongst the most active in Canada on this issue through the Canadian Media Concentration Project, which puts out regular reports on the data. You, of course, we appeared before the CRTC together on the merger issue. So you've been as active as anyone, I think, in trying to inject as much actual data into the policy discussion as possible. So why don't we start there? Can you tell me a bit about what the data tells us about how Canada ranks as a market relative to others? Are we a small player? Are we a large player? And then from a consumer perspective, what does the data tell us about the pricing in Canada for wireless services relative to other countries?
Well, I'll take the big market question. I mean, I gathered up some data in relation to the Rogers-Shaw deal, and it's clear Canada is not a small market. It is the 8th largest mobile wireless market in the world at $29 billion. I mean, we're only outstripped by big countries like the United States, China, Japan, and a few others. So, we have a very big market. It's a very lucrative one. And I think it's interesting that the CRTC also observes that yesterday in its decision too.
Okay, so we're there's sometimes we like to think of ourselves as being a small player, but when you look at it on a global basis, we're, as you say, 8th. We're a top 10 country in terms of what the market size. Ben, can you tell us a bit about the pricing that I think a lot of people have strong views about? What does the data tell us?
Yeah, so pricing is something that I've been looking at closely for a number of years, specifically in the mobile market. And there's one clear signal that virtually all of the research on this topic points to. Canada has, if not the highest, amongst the highest prices of comparable countries around the world for its mobile services. There are a number of different ways to measure this, but whether you're talking about the monthly cost of service or the cost of a gigabyte, virtually all of the research points to a real significant pricing problem in Canada. And interestingly, there has been one study published in recent years by a consulting firm called NERA on behalf of TELUS that attempted to bring a different perspective to the field But in yesterday's CRTC decision, that study was pointed out as actually having a selection bias, as unfairly representing the prices as lower than they are, and thus, in my mind, removing all doubt that the authoritative sources of data all point in the same direction.
Okay, so we had the CRTC literally call out one of the large telecom providers' studies. That's the study. The NERA work is one that I've seen pointed to many times by that company and those that have been supportive of that industry. The CRTC called it out as simply something that they couldn't rely upon.
Yeah, I think what's also interesting too is that the same author of that study was hired by TELUS to do what I characterize as a hit job on one of the reliable and really good quality independent research consultancies, Rewheel. And they've tried to drag Rewheel through the mud as Rewheel has gained traction in Canada with Competition Bureau subscribing to its services and wheeling out its reports in regulatory proceedings. Ben and I have wheeled this Rewheel's research out for years, and recently the same author of the NERA study that the CRTC decision yesterday calls out, he was hired by TELUS and got a bunch of signatories, from the kind of the who's who of the hired guns for the industry to sign on that, tried to drag Rewheel through the mud. So it was really nice to see yesterday a very, very clear statement in the decision that, this particular author in NERA studies itself was fundamentally flawed and, basically unusable for the purposes at hand.
Okay, that's interesting. In fact, I'm familiar with Rewheel. In fact, listeners of the podcast may be as well, as we had Antonius, who's one of the leaders of that organization, on the podcast some time ago to talk about what his data had been showing. So we've got sort of strong data that sort of supports precisely what I think many Canadians have long feared and been concerned about with respect to high prices. But what does the data tell us about the impact of that high pricing is, for example, on things like adoption rates in Canada or on data usage in Canada?
Yeah.
So as far as adoption rates go, I've been looking at this for a long time. I wrote a dissertation in 2015 that looked at the history of the mobile market in Canada, and adoption, I think, has been a real problem in Canada. We consistently rank right at the very bottom amongst OECD countries, comparable industrialized economies. This is something that has persisted through the era of feature phones and has continued now into smartphone adoption. In particular, what you see is that while people earning amongst the highest levels of income are adopting mobile services universally, people who are earning less than about $60K a year are really struggling to afford the service. And I think Dwayne probably has a lot to say about how the prices are impacting people's use of those services, those who can afford service in the first place.
Yeah, Dwayne, I'd love if you could jump in on that. I know even from the perspective of my own family, we're on a share everything plan with multiple kids in the house. And for years, as you head towards the end of the month, you start paying close attention to the amount of data usage and start at times asking people to cut back given the pricing. What does your research show about usage in Canada?
Yeah, well, the adoption issue that Ben points to is absolutely critical. But then when you start to realize that, the high price of data, these really constrained data allowances that the companies have been offering for years, even though they're now slightly, increasing, these are a real constraint on how people use their mobile phones and how they use the mobile internet. And so right now, Canadians on average are using about just under 3 gigabytes of data per month. And this is growing quickly. But when you look at Canadians' use of mobile data relative to the OECD average, it's about half. And then when you look at the US, we're at about a third of the US. And I mean, I was looking at some FCC study or reports the other day, and basically, we're at today where Americans were in 2015, 2016. And so this whole idea that, data is being rationed out like this, and that somehow Canadians are using too much internet, I think it's just ludicrous. And that somebody like yourself, Michael, and your family would have to be looking over your shoulder to see if you and the kids are using too much internet. I mean, this is just crazy. This is crazy town.
So Canada's got high prices, lower adoption, and lower usage. It's remarkable to hear that we're about a half decade behind where the United States is in terms of usage. We've often seen attempts to explain some of this away by references to Canada's geography or to network quality. What do you see as the culprit? Why are those prices so high?
Referring back to that study that we discussed, the DuPont study, one of the things that they tried to do in that study was to correct for the general prevailing wage levels, the cost of living. I've even seen studies that have tried to correct for the amount of snowfall per year when calculating mobile prices. In this decision that we got from the CRTC yesterday, they dismissed that, and I think that this is a real validation of the concerns that a lot of us have had for a long time. It's comes several years after the Competition Bureau came to a similar conclusion when assessing the takeover of MTS in Manitoba by Bell. And it's the primary culprit behind the high prices in Canada is a lack of competition. We're not talking about problems associated with building in a big country. We're not talking about having to buy extra parkas for your workers. We're talking about a market that's controlled by companies who have the ability and incentive to raise prices and take advantage of that when they get the chance.
Okay, Dwayne, you have anything to add? I mean, it comes down to competition, and it is quite remarkable. I did see that reference from the CRTC, where having now seen all of this data from really all sides or all proponents on this, coming to the conclusion that yes, prices are high, and the culprit here is competition.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite interesting, and Ben and I talked about this a little bit last night. You read through the decision, and it's like box after box is just checked in terms of what the problems are, and concentration is a taproot of the problems that we're experiencing. And I think one of the things about the decision that I really like is that everything that we and others have been saying for close to a decade now, the staff analysis in the report basically confirms. All right, so it's really, really nice to see that. So it seems to me that we've got this situation where the staff at the CRTC this time are doing their job. They're doing it well, but there's a split between the staff and the management. Of course, this is conjecture on my part here, but it's kind of these two weird solitudes, and it's almost like the Competition Bureau's own kind of process back with the Bell MTS decision in 2017. Competition Bureau staff came out with a report to the commissioners that clearly advised against approving the deal for a variety of reasons about, adoption levels, MTS being a good competitive check, and so on and so forth. The commissioners went ahead and blessed the deal. And so here we have yesterday, the CRTC staff, really just, great analysis throughout the report, everything about concentration, high prices, investment just being, it's mediocre in this country. It's not bad, but it's not exceptionally good. Network quality, not explaining things, the whole 9 yards. And then we get this, the crazy remedy that management decides to come up with. It's just, it's a very strange situation.
I was just going to say, sort of taking what Dwayne's just said home, the obvious culprit for the high prices is, I think, as everybody knows, it has been confirmed by this decision from the CRTC, is a lack of competition. But we also, I think, have to lay some of the blame on decision makers, because it's not as if this is public decision makers and regulators. It's not as if this is a problem that's just appeared out of nowhere. For years, this is something that has been looked at and addressed, and the solutions that have been arrived at have been insufficient. So I think the fact that this is a problem that has been ongoing for so long in the country really squarely lays the blame on regulators who continue to come out with half measures and hesitate to take the necessary action that's needed to resolve the issue.
Yeah, we've seen that hesitation certainly in the past. This whole proceeding, if you look over the years, there's been times where almost the entire record and analysis from the CRTC seems to point in one direction, and then ultimately they get cold feet or stop short of actually addressing that issue. So, that in some ways I think provides us with a good segue into those decisions. We see the competition concerns, and there's blame to be laid all over the place, decision makers and the regulator. for why we find ourselves in that space. I've addressed MVNO issues on a number of podcasts in the past. Elliot Noss from Ting, Andy Kaplan-Mirth from Tech Savvy, both have come on the podcast. But for those that are new to the issue, I'd appreciate if Ben or Dwayne, one of you can provide a bit of an explainer on what was at issue in this case.
Mhm. I'll let Ben take that one because he was directly involved in this one, much more than I was. So,
Yeah, so myself and together with Dwayne, we've actually, Dwayne is being modest. We've been involved as independent scholars and working together with coalitions of public interest groups in wireless files before the CRTC and before the Competition Bureau for about 10 years together now. Working closely with data that Dwayne collects and also with data that I collect about the state of the market. And essentially, what we have here is a market that's controlled by 3 dominant providers across the country with a handful of others who have a regional presence. Government policy has attempted to address the stranglehold that Bell, Rogers, and TELUS have in this market since 2008, and their chosen method of doing it has been to bring about a new competitor that owns its own facilities across the country. This type of policy, while it's slowly produced some results, most notably in Quebec, where a strong regional incumbent has been able to gain some ground, has also faced substantial setbacks, for instance, with the sale of MTS in 2017, but also notably with the failure of a slew of the smaller entrants that had been hoped to bring this type of competition from 2008. Mobilicity was eventually bought by Rogers after a protracted period in creditor protection, as well as Public Mobile, which was a discount brand ultimately bought and folded into TELUS. So we have a government policy that's made small gains, but is essentially set to be on the chopping block with this Rogers-Shaw merger that we're expecting to be reviewed and probably pass in the next year or so with maybe minor adjustments. The CRTC, it was hoped in this decision, was going to be striking out on a new direction, recognizing these facts, that a reliance on regional competitors isn't necessarily something that's going to get us to where we need to be. And so they were examining the possibility of applying the tried and true method that they use for the same companies operating on home internet service, which is to allow wholesale access for companies like Tech Savvy, eBox, vMedia to come in and to compete on price based on the cost of providing service and not based on the desire to provide dividends to shareholders based on monopoly rents. Essentially, the issue here, in a nutshell, is whether the CRTC was going to bring more competition using service-based providers as opposed to requiring the construction of additional mobile networks across the country.
Okay, so the question in terms of that form of injecting new forms of competition, and what did the CRTC conclude? We've already talked about their recognition of the problems we face from a competition perspective. Did they embrace the MVNO approach, Ben?
No, I mean, unfortunately, like I said, I think there was pretty high hopes. The commission, in its notice of consultation where they announced this hearing, had expressed a preliminary view that this was something they'd be interested in. And in fact, the way that the decision was presented to the media suggested that the CRTC was, in fact, going to be going forward with an MVNO approach. MVNO standing for Mobile Virtual Network Operator, which essentially means a company that rents access to the mobile network and then sells direct to the customer, configuring their own product and pricing according to their own views of the market and ability to attract customers. Unfortunately, what the CRTC actually did, in fact, was slightly expand what's available to companies who have their own networks already. So essentially, they've taken the V out of MVNO and have created what I'm calling an MVNO policy. A company who buys spectrum or who has spectrum can gain access to sell to customers in places before they've built the network. Unfortunately, there's 3 things that the CRTC hopes that someone like this will emerge. We saw with Bell MTS, and I think we're seeing probably with Shaw and Rogers that the government's approach tends to be in these cases to take actually existing competition we have when it starts to wane and to replace it with the hope for imaginary new competition. There are 3 reasons why I don't think that the CRTC's approach is going to be workable in this case. First, they're requiring spectrum licenses, which only become available on a periodic basis. There are few eligible bidders to get these spectrum licenses, and the areas in which these licenses are available in this current upcoming auction are relatively small, limiting the pool of potential new companies that could emerge. Second, the CRTC they've opted not to regulate the rates at which this access will be based, which is a big red flag. Because the reason we have regulated roaming in mobile in the first place, which has enabled the expansion of companies like Freedom and Videotron, is that the regulator found in 2015 that commercial negotiation just doesn't work. A company that wants to come to the table with Bell, Rogers, or TELUS to negotiate prices will quickly find that they're going to hit a brick wall. And if you're a small company trying to get started up, the idea that you might go to arbitration before you can start offering your business is a business killer. And third, the CRTC has strangely decided that 7 years is long enough. They're only going to make this rule apply for the following 7 years, despite knowing that it takes decades to build a sustainable mobile network. These three factors adding up transform this from an MVNO decision into an MVNO decision, in my view.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that really runs counter, of course, to the way the CRTC tried to spin it, certainly with its release and some of the headlines and coverage that we've seen that suggests that they're opening the door to MVNOs. I did a radio interview just before we started this, where that was the initial thinking from the host was that things had been opened up. But you point out that when we combine, or when the CRTC combines, making it only available to a limited number of players who have had to add spectrum, coming with a decision, I should note, that comes after the deadline to try to get spectrum, which is itself rather odd for the next auction. Time-limited approaches and the like, what you're left with is as I say, is very unlikely to achieve anything close to what people had envisioned. Dwayne, what was your take on the decision?
Yeah, I agree with Ben there, not surprisingly, since we work so close together. But, Ben said something early on where I might have a little different view, which he suggested that, maybe the Roger Shaw deal is going to go through after it gets a few adjustments here and there, a little tinkering around the edge. I'm not so sure about that. I'm actually a little more confident that the Competition Bureau may have learned some lessons, burned once, twice shy kind of thing. And so maybe it'll have the fortitude to turn its back. But I think looking at what the Competition Bureau might do and speculating a bit, yesterday's CRTC decision, actually, for those who are opposed to the Roger Shaw deal, might be a gift. All right. I mean, it is so bad and it is so unlikely to foster more affordable prices and sustainable competition that the idea of taking out one of the best existing options now looks just like a really, really bad idea. So basically, the CRTC's decision yesterday, just how bad it is, actually throws into very sharp relief what we're going to lose if the Competition Bureau greenlights the Roger Shaw deal. So I've kind of, jokingly wondered if, maybe the chair of the CRTC is, some master chess player and playing some 3D chess here that we just don't understand. And in the long run, it's going to deliver us some goods. But anyway, so I do think the decision, the 7-year thing, line is it's just totally unrealistic. And each of the other things, so I won't take up any more time. Ben made the case very good.
I just want to add that I sure hope Dwayne is right, because I think one of the key lessons that you learn from studying this industry is that it's better to hang on to and foster the competition you've got than to pursue this "if you build it, they will come" approach. We've seen players enter the field only to be driven out by a tight and jealous guarding oligopoly. Yesterday on the National, Samer Bichet, who runs Ice Wireless in the territories and who's tried to expand into the southern parts of the country, saying that this decision is going to leave him with no option but to go south of the border. And we also, have heard from Ryan Reynolds, the movie actor who owns a mobile company that operates in the States, Mint Mobile, thinking that he'd be able to come to Canada on the basis of this decision. But I don't think people should hold their breath, because last I checked, Mint Mobile doesn't own any spectrum license. It's not eligible, and it hasn't registered for the upcoming auction. So really, keeping Freedom Mobile operating as an independent competitor is the best way forward for government. And I'll just repeat, I sure hope Dwayne is right that they don't. allow it to be sold to Rogers.
Okay, that's a really useful segue again onto the Rogers Shaw merger. Last week's episode included some of my comments on the merger from that appearance before the industry committee, but I thought it would be useful to come back and discuss further. You've talked about the experience in other kind of merger situations and hoping that we've learned from them. Can you highlight what that experience was, for example, most recently in Manitoba?
Sure, I'll take a quick crack at that. I think there's at least two lessons there that hopefully the Competition Bureau will take to heart. The first is listen to your staff. The staff provided excellent analysis and guidance at that time, and the commissioners kind of broke rank with their staff. And I think now they have a bit of mud on their face for doing so, because they can see that everything that the staff report and others that had submitted to the review process has actually come to pass, and that this idea that they could somehow gerrymander in some kind of new competitor to replace the real one that was being wiped out in this transaction has actually completely failed. I mean, we look at ExploreNet, and when we're measuring market shares and revenues of different companies across the country, we can't even find ExploreNet on the radar screen when we do our analysis. I mean, it's just not even up off the ground. So, here's this idea, you keep the bird in hand versus this fictional thing that you're going to create or gerrymander into existence. And so I think that applies to this case here. Shaw has carved out some decent market share for itself in three of Canada's most populous provinces, BC, Alberta, and Ontario, two of the country's biggest cities, Toronto and Vancouver. And I think symbolically, the idea that it's operating here in the National Capital region, Ottawa, is important. And so, basically it's got around 8% market share by subscriber and revenue level. And so why, trade off this real competitor that actually has a good track record of plowing more money into its network development, both on the wireline side and the wireless side, than Rogers does over the last 3 to 5 years? So why trade off all this good stuff and a proven track record for some promises and pledges to bring a baggie of goodies that I think you mentioned last week, Michael? This doesn't make any sense to me.
Okay, Ben, I'm going to assume you share some of the same views in terms of the impact this merger is likely to have.
Especially following the CRTC's decision yesterday, I think that the Competition Bureau really can't approve this merger and claim that it's in the interest of the country. We heard in the Bell MTS merger in 2017, them taking off the boxes very similar to how the CRTC has in this one. Regional competitors are what's bringing the price down. This is our best hope for making sure that we're meeting targets in terms of affordability and adoption of next generation technologies in the mobile market. Now that MVNO, I think, really is taken off the table, that places a even stronger onus on the Competition Bureau to do what's right for consumers and to do what's right for competition by rejecting this merger. We've heard Cogeco may be a viable candidate, and we've heard Pierre-Carl Pelado, expressing an interest in taking over the operations of Freedom Mobile at the industry committee last week. But I share Dwayne's reservations about this idea that we should be so willing to trade real competition that we've already got for some imaginary hope that a future competitor will emerge.
Okay, so strong words, Ben. Thanks for that. That highlights that. And this was a question, I should note, that came up repeatedly at committee. This question of, what if we put in conditions, and what should those conditions be? And I hear both of you taking a strong stand, saying, no, we shouldn't be having a discussion on conditions. We should be rejecting this merger altogether.
Absolutely.
Michael, can I just add that a lot of the discussion revolves around the impact on consumers? Something that we heard a fair amount about in this Indu committee, and something that Dwayne has been talking about and studying recently, is this idea of efficiencies. and also looking in competition law beyond the impact on consumers, I think it's also important to recognize here that mobile services aren't something that just serve consumers at the retail level, but it's something that underpins commerce more broadly in the country. So the idea that we'd have a merger that potentially threatens to raise prices isn't something that just affects our pocketbooks at the end of the month. It's something that affects the bottom line of business right across the industry. Anytime a pizza delivery driver shows up at your house, anytime you take an Uber, those companies have as an input mobile service. And if as a result of this merger, the price goes up for them, you can bet that that pizza is going to cost you a couple extra bucks and that ride's going to get more expensive as well.
Yeah. Dwayne?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And I remember when I started to really focus in on this back in 2012, 13, 14, there was an OECD report out at the time that mentioned that Canadian businesses were already suffering greatly, especially within an international context, because the cost of doing business internationally, communication costs, were extraordinarily high in this country, and it was handicapping small, medium-sized, and large businesses across the country. And things like the roaming fees outside the country are, they're close to extortionate at $10 to $15 a day. And so if you're a business person and you're traveling to India, China, the United States, the European Union, and you're having to pay another $10 to $15 a day to use your mobile wireless service, this is another additional cost that handicaps Canadian businesses. So I think it's an important point. And, if we have some time, I'd also like to go back to one thing here and say that, this deal isn't just about mobile wireless. I mean, this is the crown jewel, so to speak, that I think Rogers is after. But as I've been trying to really make clear, and why I don't think that the Pelado proposition will actually work, is that this affects the national internet access as well as the cable market as well. And so if, Pelado is happy to take over and, kind of bolt onto the side of Videotron, Freedom Mobile, that might be okay on the mobile wireless side, but that isn't going to do one whit to help us out on the internet access side or the cable distribution side. And especially for television and film producers, they're going to see the number of doors that they get to knock on drop from 3 to 2 in the English language markets of this country if this deal goes through. And Videotron is certainly not going to be building out a new cable network in these areas. So I think we need to, expand the discussion to consider this. And we need to realize that Shaw has done some progressive things on the internet access front that, even though it didn't compete directly or head to head in any regions with Rogers, the fact of the matter is Shaw didn't impose data caps on its internet subscribers, whereas most of the other big ISPs across the country, including Rogers, did. And so, basically in terms of best practices, Shaw stood out. When we look at the cable side on the retail side, what people sign up for when they get a cable subscription, Shaw was adopting new cable technology and set-top boxes half a decade earlier than what Rogers was doing here in Ontario. And you know what what happened as a result of that was basically Shaw had a much better network, and this forced TELUS to respond in kind and to start to plow investment into fiber to the neighborhood and fiber to the doorstep a half a decade earlier than Bell did in Ontario or Quebec, where it faced more laggardly competitors in Rogers and Videotron. So we're going to lose all of that. And I think this is a really big problem that needs to be given more attention.
Hey, I mean, I think that broader context is important. I'm glad you raised it. We're talking today about wireless, but specifically in the context of the merger, the implications spread far beyond to other aspects of our communications and indeed our broadcast system. Why don't we close with this? Obviously, views are on. You've both managed to cogently put your views on the record, both on the CRTC decision as well as the Rogers merger. What should we be doing? So we know that both of you disagree with what we've seen take place, both with the possibility of new mergers as well as the CRTC's decision on MVNOs. If you were minister for the day or CRTC chair for the day, what would you be doing right now? Dwayne, why don't you get us started?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would do is, spike the Rogers-Shaw deal. I'd be, if I was Minister Champagne, I'd be sending out signals that this deal is just a non-starter. So, save your lawyer fees and your banker fees, and get on to doing what you need to do, which is compete, which is exactly what the U.S. did when they spiked the proposed deal between AT&T and T-Mobile in 2011. And T-Mobile got the message. And what did it do? Well, it started to compete more aggressively. Bigger data allowances, more affordable pricing plans, roam like home in 100 countries. So they basically, they switched tracks. They got off the lazy build it and sell it track, and they became a real viable competitor, and they doubled their market share in a decade. So that would be my number one message. And then I would say, I'd go back to the MVNO, and I'd review and vary that to basically get rid of the timeline, the 7-year timeline, and I'd expand it to include real MVNOs, not just these facilities-based, whatever they are, because they're not even MVNOs.
Okay. Ben, you have any further ideas about what we ought to be doing?
Yeah, I think a question that we all need to be asking ourselves is, what do we want these policies to be achieving, and are they achieving those things? In the case of competition in the mobile space, I think the Competition Bureau and its record of allowing mergers with remedies that it itself doesn't assess should be thinking to itself, is this going to be enough? Did it work last time, and will it work this time? If they think hard about it enough, I think the answer will be no. And on that basis, they should be looking at ways of rejecting this merger, of fulfilling their mandate. And if they can't, I think we need to be thinking about what it is that the Competition Bureau is good for at all. Similarly with the CRTC, I listened to the chairman of the CRTC explain correctly to the industry committee last week that they have no role when it comes to telecom mergers aside from ensuring that the parties are Canadian owned. Yet the CRTC has a statutory mandate to ensure that the markets for communications in Canada are not only providing affordable, reliable, and high quality services to Canadians across the country, but that they're doing it on the basis of competition. I think that's a real problem when the CRTC says we have no role here in a giant deal, one of the largest in Canada's history, let alone in the communications industry. When the CRTC says it has no role in the structure of a market that everyone knows is going to reduce competition, we have to be asking, are we achieving our goals? Are the rules we've got achieving our goals? And if they aren't, how do we strengthen them to ensure that they do?
Ben, Dwayne, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Michael.
Long-time listener, first-time caller, and it's been a pleasure.
That's the Law Bites podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbites@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBitesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bites podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.